The passport was laminated blue, slightly dog-eared at the corner, and smelled faintly of the coffee I'd spilled on my kit bag 3 weeks ago somewhere over the Jovian relay stations. It had a small gold eagle embossed on the front cover, the old kind, the pre-compact kind, from back when Earth still issued documents by nation-state rather than species designation. It was outdated by about 11 years. It was also, apparently, the most terrifying object that Gunnery Officer Verk of the Keth Sovereignty had ever seen in his 17 cycles of service. I didn't know that yet when I slid it under the glass. I was exhausted. That's the first thing you need to understand about all of this. I had been awake for something like 41 hours. I had a 6-centimeter laceration above my left ear held together with 3 strips of medplas and a prayer, and I was standing in the processing queue at Threshold Station Keth 7, behind a delegation of Marathi traders who smelled like fermented kelp, and kept bumping me with their cargo manifests every time the queue shuffled forward by 6 inches. The queue had not moved meaningfully in 2 hours. The fluorescent strips overhead pulsed at a frequency that made my fillings ache. I was not at my best. My name is Corporal Darian Mace, formerly of the 14th Expeditionary Recon Unit, Earth Compact Forces, currently on humanitarian assignment with the Joint Survey Team cataloging ecological disruption zones along the Keth Sovereignty border. That job sounds far more dignified than it is. In practice, it means camping in exfiltration zones that still glow faintly from the quarantine wars, taking soil samples in a hazard suit that leaks at the left knee, and eating reconstituted rations that taste like someone described food to someone who had never eaten food, who then described it to someone else, who passed those notes to a machine that did its best. The machine did not do its best. The machine did something technically above its minimum contractual threshold, which is different. I had been doing this for 14 months. My unit was down to 6 from 9 because Reeves had taken a bad fall in Zone 7, because Ochoa had contracted a contact dermatitis that turned out to be not just a dermatitis, and because Sergeant Calloway had decided in month 11 that she was done, and submitted her discharge papers with the kind of calm finality that I had found both incomprehensible and deeply enviable. The 6 of us remaining had finished the catalog, submitted the final sections to the Joint Commission, packed our gear, and scattered toward whatever relay station could get us home fastest. I was supposed to rotate back to Earth in 6 weeks. I was at that moment trying to get a 3-day transit visa so I could catch the shuttle to Relay Hub Marin, connect to the inner lanes, and be on my way back to a planet that had actual seasons and restaurants, and people who communicated through something other than bioluminescent throat pulses. That's all I wanted. A transit visa and a shuttle and 6 weeks of decreasing distances between me and a cup of real coffee in my mother's kitchen. So I slid the passport under the glass. Verk, I didn't know his name yet. He was just the officer behind the processing desk, reached down without looking up from his secondary screen, lifted the document, and set it on his reader with the practiced non-attention of someone who had processed several thousand transit applications and expected this to be indistinguishable from all the others. The reader beeped. He looked at it. He looked at his screen. He looked at the passport. He looked at me. The Keth are tall. That's the first thing most humans notice, because it's impossible not to. The shortest adult Keth I had ever stood next to still cleared my head by a good 40 centimeters, and Verk was not the shortest adult Keth I had met. He had the characteristic deep-banded coloration of the officer class, amber and black striped across the orbital ridges and down the jaw, and the kind of posture that suggested he had been trained from birth to occupy exactly as much space as possible, and then 5% more. His secondary eyelids, the translucent inner ones, the ones the briefing materials called nictitating membranes in a way that made everyone in the briefing feel like they were watching a nature documentary, flickered twice, which I knew from the mandatory pre-deployment cultural orientation was either a sign of deep concentration or the Keth equivalent of a double take. He lifted the passport from the reader. He turned it over in his hands. He held it up to the overhead light with the careful delicacy of someone handling an unexploded device, examining the gold eagle embossment through the translucent inner eyelids. Then he said something in clipped Keth that my translation caller rendered after a 2-second processing lag as, "This document bears a Terran compact seal. Pre-unification nation-state designation. Authentication reads as Class 1 diplomatic status." "It's a passport," I said. My voice came out flatter than I intended, the voice of someone who has been standing in a queue for 2 hours with a laceration above their ear. "I know it's old." The compact transitioned to species designation cards in 2287, but they specified that individual nation-state documents would remain valid for the purposes of. "You are Terran," he said. It was not precisely a question. "I'm human," I said. "From Earth, yes." He stood up from his chair. "Not abruptly. The Keth do not do things abruptly. They have a cultural prohibition against abruptness in formal settings that traces back to something in their early history that the briefing materials described as the compact of measured gestures, and that I had never fully read." He stood the way a soldier stands for an inspection, deliberate and full, and he held my coffee-stained, dog-eared, outdated laminated blue passport in both hands, which I noticed for the first time was the same grip you'd use for something you did not want to drop. Behind me, the Marathi traders bumped me again with their manifests. I had stopped noticing them. I was watching Verk, who was now doing something on his console that required both hands and was apparently more complicated than standard visa processing, because the younger officer 2 stations down had looked over, and was now also looking at my passport, and had gone very still in the way that people go still when something is happening that they haven't been briefed for. Verk tapped a final sequence. A soft chime sounded, not the standard processing chime, something lower, less frequent. Then he turned to the officer 2 stations down, younger, lower ranked, the amber bands on her orbital ridges still developing their full depth, and said something in rapid Keth that my collar struggled to track. The translation came back fragmented and slightly uncertain. "Terran national document, confirmed Class 1. Need to verify the compact seal. This is a real one, not a survey affiliate. Get the attaché." The younger officer stood up. "The one beyond her." A third officer, at the far end of the line, turned from his screen and looked at me with both sets of eyelids fully retracted. I became aware, in the way that soldiers become aware of things without being able to say exactly when the awareness arrived, peripheral, instinctual, the hindbrain firing before the reasoning brain catches up, that the entire processing hall had gone very quiet. There were 11 Keth officers in the room. All of them were looking at me with the translucent inner eyelids at full extension, which in 11 months of border zone work I had come to understand was what the Keth did when something had their complete and undivided attention. A Marathi trader said something behind me. I didn't turn around. "Corporal," said Verk, and his translation collar had shifted registers. "I know how that sounds. I would not have been able to articulate it to you before 14 months of living in contact with Keth border personnel. But the collars have tonal register markers, and his had moved from processing standard into something the briefing materials called formal honorific, a mode I had personally heard applied to fleet-level officers, and once to a compact senator on a goodwill tour. Not to a corporal on a transit visa application, if you would be willing to accompany me." I picked up my kit bag. I followed him through a door behind the processing desk that required his palm print, his retinal scan, and a 9-digit code he punched from memory without looking. The room beyond was not a secondary processing area. It was not an interrogation room, which was my first thought. The lizard brain thought that surfaces whenever a uniformed official takes you off the main floor. It had chairs, actual chairs, padded, with proportions that seemed calibrated for human rather than Keth dimensions, which meant someone had either measured a human or had access to human ergonomic data, neither of which was standard equipment on a Keth border station. There was a low table in the center. On the table sat a covered tray and a carafe of something that steamed gently into the temperature-controlled air. The lighting was amber instead of the white-blue fluorescent of the processing hall, warmer, lower, and the ceiling was higher by 2 full feet. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I took in the chairs, the tray, the carafe. "Please sit," said Verk. "I will return. There is someone who needs to speak with you." He paused and then added, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing words rather than retrieving them, "You are under no obligation you are not already under, Corporal, that I want to be clear about." I nodded. He left. I sat down in one of the chairs, which fit my proportions with an uncanny accuracy that I noted and set aside. I looked at the tray. Under the cover was food not reconstituted. Real protein cuts, real grain matter on an actual plate with the kind of arrangement that required a person rather than an automated dispenser. I looked at the carafe. I lifted the lid. Steam came up and hit my face, and I closed my eyes because the smell was coffee. Not reconstituted coffee, not synthesized coffee-adjacent beverage, but coffee, the real varietal kind, the kind that smells like it came from ground beans that grew in actual soil under an actual sun. I sat there with the carafe lid in my hand and my lacerated head and my leaking knee suit and my 41 hours of accumulated not sleeping, and I poured a cup of coffee and I drank it, and I thought with the particular clarity that extreme fatigue sometimes produces when the brain finally stops performing and just perceives. Something is happening here that I don't have a frame for. And that's all right. Drink the coffee. Stay awake. Find out what comes next. The door opened 16 minutes later. Verk came back, and he was not alone. Behind him was a Keth in civilian dress, not the formal civilian dress of diplomatic occasions, but the everyday civilian dress of someone who was high enough ranked that the everyday version was already impressive. She was older than Verk by what I estimated as 20 years, with the deep charcoal banding of someone past active service, the color so dark it was nearly uniform, and she moved through the room the way certain people move through rooms, as though the room had arranged itself around her requirements rather than the other way around. She sat down across the table from me and folded her hands on the surface, four-fingered, long, the knuckles articulated differently from ours, but the gesture identical, and looked at me with both sets of eyelids fully retracted, the wide-open look, the one that I had learned was the Keth version of, "I am paying complete attention to you, and I want you to know it." "Corporal Mace," she said. Her translation collar was a better model than Verk's, the translation seamless, none of the processing lag jitter. "My name is Arath. I hold the position of Senior Diplomatic Attaché to this station and 3 adjacent sovereignty border posts. I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand clearly that what I am about to ask is not an interrogation, not a security assessment, and not anything that bears on your transit application, which is already approved and will be waiting for you regardless of what is said here." She paused. "It is a question born of the Terran word, I believe, is wonder." I looked at her. I looked at my passport, which Verk had placed on the table between us with the same two-handed careful grip. "Go ahead," I said. "How did you come to be carrying a pre-unification Terran document?" I stared at her for a moment. "It's my passport," I said. "I was born in 2269. I got it when I was 19 before I shipped out the first time. Standard issue." The compact moved to the species designation cards in 2287, and I kept meaning to update it. But I was deployed when the changeover happened, and then it kept getting pushed down the list. It still authenticates. I've used it at Marin Hub, at Relay 4, at the compact checkpoints on the entire survey corridor without a single. "Yes," she said, "it authenticates. That is not the question." She was quiet for a moment. The Keth have a particular quality of silence, not empty, not waiting, but inhabited, like the silence is itself a form of speech. The question is whether you understand what that document represents to the Keth sovereignty. I did not understand what that document represented to the Keth sovereignty. She read that from my face. The Keth are expert readers of faces. Their own facial musculature is comparatively limited, which over thousands of years of evolution had apparently produced a compensatory hypersensitivity to the expressions of others. Arith read my face and nodded once, the small nod, the one that means, "This is what I expected, and it is not a criticism." "Then let me tell you something," she said, "that your historians likely know, but that most of your people walking these corridors do not. This is where I need to tell you about the war. Not the quarantine wars, everyone knows those. They are in every history feed. They are the reason half the border zones glow faintly at night, and why there is a joint survey commission in the first place. I mean the earlier thing. The thing that happened 40 years before the quarantine wars, when the Keth sovereignty first made formal contact with Earth. The Keth had been watching us, Arith told me, for 600 years. Not the way conspiracy feeds describe it, not implanted surveillance devices, not covert contact, not anything that required proximity. Watching the way an ecologist watches a distant ecosystem through instrumentation. Orbital arrays, atmospheric sampling, electromagnetic monitoring, the slow, patient accumulation of data about a species that had appeared, apparently spontaneously, on the third planet of an unremarkable star system, and had begun, against every probability their models projected, to develop intelligence and then language and then agriculture and then cities and then industry, and then the tools that would eventually lead them off their planet and out into the dark. At every stage of this development, the Keth Sovereignty's Projective Sciences Division, which Arith described as the oldest and most respected academic institution in the sovereignty, housed in a complex of towers on the Keth homeworld that had stood for 4,000 years, had run their models and produced their timelines and arrived at the same conclusion. This species would be extinct within 150 years, 200 at the outside. The variables changed. Sometimes it was atmospheric degradation, sometimes resource depletion, sometimes the particular self-accelerating logic of weapons development. But the conclusion was stable across 17 independent modeling frameworks and 600 years of observational data. They were wrong every time. Every time the timeline said, now, every time the models said, this is the cascade that ends it, something would happen. Some human decision or human stubbornness or human improvisation that the models hadn't accounted for. A treaty signed at the last possible moment. A technology developed 15 years ahead of schedule. A mass coordination event that looked from the outside like pure chaos and produced, inexplicably, something that worked. This was, Arith said, a source of significant and prolonged institutional embarrassment for the Projective Sciences Division. There were careers ended. There was a formal inquiry in cycle 340. The models were rebuilt from the ground up 3 times. They kept failing in the same direction. She paused. Through the window of the room, there was a window I hadn't noticed, a narrow horizontal strip that looked out onto the station's maintenance corridor. I could see the slow movement of a maintenance drone tracking its circuit. But that is not what the document means, she said. That is context. The document's meaning, she told me, was this. When formal first contact was made, 40 years before the quarantine wars, the Keth delegation that arrived in the Sol system had done so with careful preparation and considerable nervousness, because the Projective Sciences Division had, despite 17 failed models and 600 years of being wrong about our extinction, finally produced a model they were confident in, which predicted that the humans they met would be either extraordinarily cooperative or extraordinarily dangerous, depending on how the first exchange went. The margin between those outcomes was, according to the model, very narrow. The Keth delegation had prepared extensively for this. They had protocols, scripts, a sequence of exchanges designed to establish trust through demonstrated reciprocity and clear hierarchy signaling. Because the Keth negotiate through hierarchy, and the clearest message of good faith a Keth can send is, "I acknowledge where you stand and I show you where I stand, and we proceed from that known ground." The human delegation had also prepared. They had the UN General Assembly resolution and a broadcast on every frequency. And then, at the end of the formal exchange, one of the human diplomats, the records had his name as Dr. James Nakamura, career Foreign Service officer, and the personal detail that he had been awake for 31 hours at the time of the meeting, which Arith noted with something in her voice that I could only interpret as affection, had reached into his jacket and produced his passport and handed it to the lead Keth delegate. He hadn't done it as part of the protocol. It wasn't in the script. When he was asked about it afterward in the historical record, he said he'd done it because it felt right, because he wanted to give them something real, something personal, something with his actual name on it, something that said, "This is me, not the institution, not the government, me." Two of the other human diplomats had followed his lead. 3 passports in the end. Pre-unification, nation-state issue, bearing the seals of countries that no longer existed as independent entities by the time the compact superseded them. In Keth diplomatic tradition, in a tradition that was 4,000 years old and carried the weight of every alliance and betrayal and reconciliation in Keth history, you do not give a stranger a document that bears your personal seal unless you are extending to them the full protection of your house. The document says, "This person is mine, and whatever befalls them befalls us, and we will answer for each other before any authority in the known worlds." It is not a gesture. It is not symbolic. It is the oldest and most binding form of Keth covenant making, older than the towers of the projective sciences division, older than the sovereignty itself. The humans had not known that. They were handing over their passports because they wanted to make something personal, because Dr. Nakamura had been awake for 31 hours and had felt something in that room and had reached for the only thing in his pocket that could say what he meant. The Keth had understood it as a covenant. For 40 years before the quarantine wars fractured everything, every human who presented one of those pre-unification seals at a Keth border post was extended full covenant protection. Not courtesy, not diplomatic consideration. Covenant. The Keth concept that rendered into compact standard as ward of the covenant, which was the closest translation Arith's collar could produce, but which she described to me as a person who carries our protection as completely as a person of our own blood. Then the quarantine wars happened. The sovereignty and the compact spent 20 years in a conflict that neither side had wanted, and that had started from a resource corridor dispute that a single month of better communication might have resolved. The passport stopped meaning anything. Humans stopped showing up at Keth border stations with pre-unification documents because humans stopped going to Keth border stations at all, and when the contact resumed it was through official channels, species designation cards, joint commission credentials. Clean. Institutional. Nothing with a personal seal, nothing with a name. "We assumed," Arith said, "that the covenant had been dissolved by the war, that it had lapsed, as covenants sometimes do when the conditions that created them are destroyed." She looked at my passport. It was a source of significant grief. I want you to understand that. For those of us in the diplomatic corps who knew the history, who understood what had been offered and what had been accepted, the loss of it was not abstract. The Keth do not make covenant lightly, and we do not release it lightly. And the idea that the war had severed it was, she paused. It was very difficult. She looked at me directly, both eyelids retracted, the full attention. "And then you walked through our processing line." I looked at my passport. I looked at Arith. I looked at Verk, who was standing by the door with his secondary eyelids at full retraction, and his hands clasped in a formal posture I had seen once before, in a historical briefing clip used by Keth military honor guards. "I spilled coffee on it," I said. It was the only thing I could think to say. Arith's facial plates moved through a pattern I had never seen before on a Keth face. It took me several seconds to identify it as something in the register of laughter, not the Keth version of a smile, which involves the lower orbital muscles, but something deeper and less performative, the movement of someone who has just encountered something they were not prepared to find funny and have found funny anyway. "I know," she said. "The scanner recorded the staining pattern. There was considerable discussion this afternoon about whether the covenant extended to coffee-damaged documents." A pause. "It does." What followed was 3 days that I am still not sure how to accurately describe. Not because the events themselves were complicated. They were, in their essentials, very simple. I was given quarters, I was given food, I was given medical attention for my laceration, I was given time. But the simplicity of it was its own particular strangeness, because I had been operating for 14 months in conditions where everything cost something, where rest was a resource to be allocated and warmth was contingent on equipment performance, and the small human requirements, a real meal, a window, an hour of quiet, were permanent background desires that you got good at not thinking about. Being in those quarters was like suddenly being allowed to think about them. Like the pressure had been removed from a place that had been under pressure, so long it had forgotten what the absence of pressure felt like. The window in my quarters looked out onto the station's external observation ring, and beyond it the slow wheeling dark, and the blue-white band of the planet below the station, and the distant thread of the inner shipping lanes that I had been trying to reach for 6 weeks. I stood at that window for a long time the first night. The station's arbitrary light cycle, which ran 17 hours rather than 24, and which my body had been silently resenting since I arrived, and I looked at the lanes. I thought about home. I had been not thinking about home for 14 months with the practiced discipline of someone who has learned that thinking about home in the field is expensive. It costs attention you need for other things. It produces a kind of low-grade ache that doesn't actually become bearable until you're back, and it does nothing constructive in the interim. I had gotten very good at not thinking about it. But standing there at the window, with the coffee cooling in my hand and the lanes tracking their light across the dark, I let myself think about it. The way the light is different in October. The way the city sounds on Sunday mornings. My mother's voice when she answers the door. The smell of actual coffee in an actual kitchen on an actual planet with actual gravity that has been stable for 4.5 billion years and will continue to be stable long after all of us are through. On the second day, Arith sent a physician. Not a medical drone, a person, a Keth physician, young, who spoke no compact standard but who communicated through a kind of precise gestural clarity that transcended the language gap. She examined the laceration with instruments I didn't recognize, made some sounds that I interpreted as professional assessment, and replaced my MedPlus strips with something from her kit that sealed so cleanly and cooled so immediately that I sat there for a moment, just processing the fact that my head had stopped hurting. Before she left, she turned back from the door and did something I had not seen a Keth do in 14 months of working border zones. She pressed her palm flat against the door frame, the long Keth fingers spread wide, all four, the gesture requiring full extension, and inclined her head. Not a bow, something quieter, more considered. It was a gesture, Arith told me when I described it that evening, that roughly translated as, "May your ground be firm." It was a phrase used in Keth healing traditions, the formal acknowledgement at the end of a medical visit, and it was approximately 2,000 years old. "She used it for a human," I said. "Yes," said Arith. "She did." On the third day, Arith came herself to my quarters, and she brought tea, Keth tea, which I had heard described and had always imagined would be terrible, and which tasted like pine resin and honey, and something mineral that sat underneath the other flavors like a low note that you felt more than heard. She sat in the chair by the window, and I sat on the bed, and we talked for 4 hours. Not about politics, not about the covenant or the diplomatic history or what my transit document would look like when it was processed. We talked about what people talk about when the formal business is done, and there is time, and they find, to their mild surprise, that they want to fill it with something real. Areth had been to Earth once, 30 years ago, briefly, in the earliest days of the post-war reconciliation period when such trips were still extraordinary and required considerable institutional permission. She had spent 3 days in a coastal city. She had seen the ocean. She described it the way everyone who has ever seen the ocean for the first time describes it, which is in the language of scale. There is always the moment when the intellect's model of it collides with the actual thing, and the intellect realizes it was working from entirely wrong parameters. The model says, large body of water. The body of water says, I'm not a large body of water, I'm a thing you do not have a category for, and your category of large is not adequate to what you are looking at. I stood on the edge of it, she said, and I could not see the end of it in any direction. Her secondary eyelids flickered. We have no equivalent on the Keth homeworld. We have aquifers, managed reservoirs, engineered water systems that are very large by our standards. She paused. I had seen images, I had seen surveys, I had not understood. It looks different from space, I said. You can see the whole thing. It's most of the planet. Its blue isn't even the right word, it's a color that only exists when you have that much water that deep. I know, she said. I saw it from the approach. She was quiet for a moment. I have thought about it for 30 years. I think about it regularly. It seems to me that it is the kind of thing that, once seen, cannot be adequately stored in memory. Only in the place behind memory, the place you go to when you are very still. I thought about that. I thought about the exfiltration zones at night, the way the bioluminescence came back to damaged soil in the recovery areas, the slow, bright threading of the fungal networks through dead ground, the planet very quietly and very stubbornly sewing itself back together with its own materials. I told her about it. She was quiet for a long time. The Keth have a word, she said finally, for the moment when a living thing refuses to stop, when the conditions say, this ends here. When the resources are depleted and the damage is compound and the systems are failing, and the living thing looks at all of this and proceeds anyway, not because it has enough, because it has decided not to stop. She said the word, a long Keth syllable that resonated in the frequencies my hearing could catch, and several it probably couldn't, my collar doing what it could with it and arriving at nothing usable. There is no compact standard equivalent, she said. We use it for rivers in drought years, for certain species of tree that grow in our northern volcanic zones, where the soil chemistry should preclude growth entirely, for soldiers who have sustained what the medical systems classify as unsurvivable injuries and have survived them. She looked at me. We have used it across the centuries for humans, as a category, not individual humans, the category, the species. There was considerable academic debate about whether it was appropriate to apply a term for individual organisms to an entire civilization, but the consensus, after the 6th or 7th failed extinction projection, was that the category was apt. I didn't say anything. Outside the window, the lanes moved their slow light across the face of the dark, and the planet below turned, and somewhere down there in the managed reservoirs the Keth were calculating rainfall, and somewhere 600 light-years away there was a beach that a diplomatic attaché had stood on 30 years ago and had never stopped thinking about. The quarantine wars were a catastrophe, Areth said. I was junior staff then. I watched the negotiations fail. I watched the corridors close. I watched what had been built across 40 years of contact, the careful, imperfect, real thing that had been built, come apart. Her hands on the table moved in a subtle gesture I didn't have the vocabulary to read precisely. And I watched the humans go, and I thought they will not come back. Why would they come back? She picked up her cup of tea. She looked at it. But you came back, she said. Not formally, not through official channels. You came back through the survey zones and the relay stations and the border posts, one at a time in your leaking suits with your outdated documents doing your work. You came back the way you always come back, without announcing it, without ceremony, without anyone being entirely sure it was happening until it was already happening. She set the cup down. And then a corporal with a coffee-stained passport walked through my processing line, and I had to call an emergency meeting of 3 senior staff to remember how to do something we had been waiting 11 years to do. I looked at her. I looked at my passport on the table between us. What are you going to do with it? I said. With the Covenant, now that it's back. That is the question, she said. That is precisely the question. She was quiet for a moment. I think we begin the way all things of this kind begin, slowly, one document at a time. One conversation at a time. She looked at me directly. I think we begin here. On the 4th morning, Verk came himself to escort me to the boarding platform. The platform was the main one, not the secondary transit dock where I had arrived and where I had expected to leave. The main platform was long and high-ceilinged, and currently occupied by a Marathi delegation that was boarding in an elaborate ceremonial fashion that required them to announce themselves at each checkpoint in a call-and-response format that sounded, to my ear, like a song. Beyond them, my shuttle was visible through the transparent steel barrier. A standard compact liner, nothing remarkable, the same class I'd taken from Marin Hub, looking very small against the scale of the Keth architecture around it. Arith had come. I had been told this was not standard procedure and had been given to understand, through the delicate communication of things that are said around a thing rather than about it, that it was causing a certain amount of quiet astonishment among the younger officers on the platform. She was in formal dress now, the deep charcoal banding very sharp against the pale fabric, and she had with her a document case that she carried with both hands, the two-handed grip. Verk presented me with my transit document. It was not a 3-day stamp. It was a 6-month open passage, valid for all Keth sovereignty stations and inner corridors and the border relay hubs, marked with a seal I had not seen before. I looked at it. I looked at Arith. That seal, I said, is the same one, she said, as the diplomatic passports, as the ones Dr. Nakamura carried. She held out the document case. We have made you one. It is not identical. The nation-state original is yours, and we would not replicate it without authorization, but this is the sovereignty's response, as it should have been made 11 years ago and was not because we assumed the covenant had lapsed. She paused. It has not lapsed. I want to say that clearly. Covenants properly made do not lapse. They wait. I took the document case. I held it with both hands because it seemed correct. You'll want to keep it somewhere dry, said Verk. His translation collar had shifted registers again into something warm, away from the coffee. I laughed. It surprised me, not the joke, but the laugh itself, the fact that it came out full and real and not the compressed, tactical laugh I'd been producing for 14 months, the laugh that said, I have registered that something amusing has happened, but I cannot fully engage with it at this time. This was the other kind, the kind that arrives from somewhere below the managed surface. Verk's secondary eyelids flickered. The younger officers on the platform, who had been maintaining professional composure with visible effort, stopped maintaining it. Arith made the movement I had identified as adjacent to laughter. Safe transit, Corporal, she said. I boarded the shuttle. I found my seat. I put the document case in my left breast pocket and my coffee-stained passport in my right, where it had lived for 15 years, where it had gotten the coffee stain, where it had ridden through Marin Hub and Relay 4 and 14 months of survey work, and 1 queue at Threshold Station Keth 7, behind a delegation of Marathi traders. Here is what I thought about on the shuttle. Here is what I have been thinking about since, and I have had time. The transit back is long. I thought about those 3 diplomats. I thought about Dr. Nakamura, 31 hours awake, standing in a room where the future was being decided in a language he didn't fully speak, reaching into his jacket and taking out the most personal object he had on him and handing it to an alien he had never met because it felt right, because he wanted to make it real. Because the institution and the resolution and the broadcast on every frequency were important and necessary, and exactly the right things to bring, and they were not enough, and he knew they were not enough, and the only thing he had that was more personal than all of that was his name on a piece of laminated paper with a gold eagle on the front. I thought about the word Arith had said, the one that didn't translate, the one for the river in the drought year, the tree in the volcanic soil, the soldier who should not have survived, the one the Keth had been applying to our species for 600 years while their models kept failing in the same direction. I thought, we didn't know what we were doing, any of it. Nakamura didn't know what handing over a passport meant to a species he'd never met. The species cards didn't come with an explanation of what they'd replaced or what the replacement had cost. I had been carrying that passport for 15 years without knowing it was carrying anything other than my photograph and my date of birth. And the Keth had watched this, had watched 600 years of a species operating without full information, making gestures that meant more than the gesturers knew, surviving things that shouldn't have been survivable, coming back through the border posts one at a time in leaking suits with outdated documents. And they had a word for it that their collars couldn't translate into ours, because we don't have the concept, because the concept would require us to see ourselves from the outside, to see the shape of the thing we are doing, without being able to see it from inside it. From the inside, it doesn't feel like anything. From the inside, it just feels like, I need to get home. I need a transit visa. I've been awake for 41 hours. I have 3 strips of medplas on my head. I am going to stand in this queue for as long as it takes, and then I am going to get on that shuttle, and then I am going to get on the next shuttle and the next and the one after that. And I am going to keep doing that until I am standing in my mother's kitchen drinking actual coffee. Because that is what is on the other side of this, and that is what I am moving toward, and I am going to keep moving toward it for exactly as long as it takes. That's not heroic. That's not even particularly notable. That's just a person who wants to go home. But the Keth had watched 600 years of that. 600 years of individual people with individual things they wanted to get to, moving toward them with the particular stubbornness of creatures that had evolved in a hard place and had never quite shed the stubbornness that the hard place had selected for, and what they had seen, what the projective sciences division could not account for in 17 separate models, was that when you got enough of those individual people moving toward enough of those individual things, the aggregate of it was something that looked, from the outside, like a force of nature. Not because any one of us was extraordinary, because none of us were willing to stop. The shuttle banked into the inner lane approach corridor, and the nav system gave its 3-tone alert, and out the window the stars went from fixed points to the long streaked lines of lane transition, the familiar lurch and then the smoothing, and somewhere behind me, a Marathi trader's cargo manifest slid off the overhead rack and hit the floor with a sound like a dropped book. I had my covenant document in my left breast pocket and my coffee-stained passport in my right, and the lanes were running smooth ahead of me, and there were 6 weeks between me and a kitchen and a cup of real coffee and a door that someone would hear me knock on, and I thought, I will tell her this story. I would tell it the way soldiers tell stories, not in sequence, not in the order that makes the most sense, usually at a table, usually at night, usually arriving at the end sideways, and then sitting with it for a while before anyone says anything. I would tell her about the queue and the passport and the coffee and the word that wouldn't translate. I would tell her about Arith standing at the boarding platform in formal dress with the document case in both hands, and Verk and the coffee joke, and the physician with the gesture that meant may your ground be firm, 2,000 years old, said to a human for the first time in 11 years. And she would sit across the table from me, and she would listen the way she had always listened, which was the kind of listening that made you feel like what you were saying was worth the saying. And when I was done, she would say, "You're all right then." And I would say, yeah, I'm all right. The lane ran smooth. The stars streaked. Somewhere behind me, the manifest was still lying on the floor, and the Marathi trader was swearing at it in a language my collar rendered as, "This is the third time today, and I am genuinely reconsidering this entire profession." I thought about the ocean, about what Arith had said, the thing she had been carrying for 30 years, the thing that couldn't be stored in memory, only in the place behind it. I thought she should come back, stand on the edge of it again. There is more of it than she remembered. There is always more than you remembered, and there is always more time than the model's project. The Keth had been projecting our extinction for 600 years. They were going to be wrong again. I settled back in the seat and closed my eyes. The lane hummed its constant note, the sound of distance being eaten, the sound of the gap between here and home getting smaller with every second. The food tray in my bag had a plate on it, a real plate, ceramic, stamped with the Keth sovereignty mark, that someone had tucked in alongside my transit documents when I wasn't looking, with a small square of cloth on top of it, the Keth equivalent of a note, which Arith had told me bore the phrase, "For the journey." For the journey. Outside the shuttle window, the Keth sovereignty's inner corridors gave way to the border transition markers, the familiar double-ring buoys of the compact boundary, and beyond them the shipping lanes broadened and the traffic increased and the stars out the forward port became recognizable again, the configurations I had grown up with, the ones that meant, "You are close." I thought about the word. The river in the drought year. The tree in the volcanic soil. The soldier who should not have been alive and was alive. The species that had been running out of time for 6 centuries and had never quite run out. I thought, I have a word for it. The word is home. Not a place exactly. Not a kitchen or a city or a planet, though it is all of those things. The word means the thing you are moving toward. The thing that is on the other side of whatever is currently between you and it. The thing that is specific enough and real enough and worth it enough that you will stand in the queue for 2 hours with a laceration above your ear and coffee on your passport and 41 hours without sleep, and you will slide your document under the glass, and you will wait for what comes next. The shuttle crossed the boundary. The sun came on through the forward port, still small, still distant, but warm, recognizably warm. I was going home. And somewhere on Threshold Station Keth 7, a diplomatic attaché was standing at a window looking at something she had been thinking about for 30 years. And in the projective sciences division of the Keth homeworld, someone was probably already failing to model what happened next. And in the soil of the exfiltration zones along the border, the fungal networks were threading through the dark, very quietly, very patiently, sewing the ground back together. The things that refuse to stop. We always come back. There's something I haven't said yet about the second day on the station, and I want to say it because it matters, and because I've been circling it since I got on this shuttle, and I might as well just say it. On the second day, after the physician left, I went back to the window for a while, and then I sat on the edge of the bed and I cried. Not the kind of crying that has a clear cause, not grief, not relief exactly, not any single identifiable thing. The kind that happens when you have been operating at a sustained level of managed difficulty for a long time and something gives way, not in a catastrophic direction, just sideways. The tension releases in the way that old, tight things release, a slow unlocking, and the body does what bodies do when the thing they have been braced against is no longer there to brace against. I didn't cry for long. I am not describing this as a notable event. I am describing it because it is relevant to something I want to say about what happened next. What happened next was that Verk came by to check whether I needed anything, food, more coffee, information about the station facilities, and I opened the door with my face still slightly blotchy in the manner of someone who has recently been crying. And Verk looked at me for a moment with both sets of eyelids, in the configuration I had come to associate with careful attention. And then he said, "I have been informed that humans sometimes require a thing the translation renders as company. Not conversation, just presence." I looked at him. "I have no pressing duties until the next processing cycle," he said, "if that is useful." I thought about this for a moment, then I stepped back from the door. He came in. He stood by the window because the chairs were sized for humans and standing was clearly more comfortable for him, and I sat on the bed, and we were quiet for about 10 minutes, which is a long time to be quiet with someone you have known for less than 24 hours. It wasn't uncomfortable. It had the quality that certain silences have, not empty, not awkward, but occupied. Two people in a room, separately thinking, each aware of the other. At some point Verk said, "The exfiltration zones." He said it without preamble, without transition. "You worked in them for 14 months. "Yes," I said. "What do they look like?" he said. "From the ground. The briefing materials have survey imagery, but survey imagery is a view from above. I have wondered what they look like from within them." I thought about this. I thought about how to describe something that I had spent 14 months in and had simultaneously been trying not to fully see, because fully seeing it was expensive in the same way that thinking about home was expensive. "At night," I said, "they glow. The residual radiation from the quarantine wars, it's mostly inert now, mostly low-level, the kind that shows up on instruments before it shows up in biology, but at night you can see it in the soil. Blue-white faint, like the ground is lit from underneath. The bioremediation survey crews call it ghost light." I paused. "In the recovery areas, the zones where the remediation has been running long enough to take hold, the bioluminescent organisms come back first. Before the visible plants, before anything you'd recognize as life returning. Just this faint web of light in the dark, under the surface. The fungal networks threading through. Like the soil is breathing." Verk was quiet. Outside the window, the maintenance drone made its circuit again. "We called it ghost light," I said, "but I think that's the wrong name for it. Ghost light sounds like something lingering from a death. What I was watching was something else, something that was coming back." Verk said the word again, the untranslatable one. He said it quietly, as if to himself, and I knew from the context what he meant by it. "Yeah," I said, "I think so." We were quiet for another few minutes. Then Verk said, "I have been stationed at this post for 6 years. I have processed several thousand transit applications. I have never in 6 years encountered a pre-unification document." He paused. "I have known about the covenant since my training. It was covered in one session, approximately an hour. It was described as historical." He said the word historical with a flatness that suggested he was describing something that had been presented to him as closed, and which he was now understanding was not. "The session," he said, "described the covenant as, I believe the word the instructor used was dormant. Not dissolved, dormant." He looked at me. "I have thought about that word many times since this morning." "Dormant," I said. "Like seeds," he said. "In drought years, the seed is not dead, it is waiting for conditions." I looked at my passport on the table. "I spilled coffee on it in a relay station cafeteria 3 weeks ago," I said. "I was tired and I knocked over my cup. That's the whole story of how the SEAL survived 14 months and a survey catalog and 4 relay station checkpoints." "Yes," said Verk. His secondary eyelids worked through their slow flicker. "I know. The scanner recorded the impact angle of the spill." A pause. "I have also thought about that, about whether the Covenant's survival was contingent on the right moment, the right station, the right officer recognizing it." Another pause. "But I think the more accurate framing is, the Covenant survives because the thing it was made between survives. The seed is in the seed, not in the conditions. I looked at him for a moment. You're wasted in processing, I said. Verk's secondary eyelids flickered in the pattern I had finally, on day 2, identified as the Keth expression of amusement. I enjoy processing, he said. Today has clarified why. On the morning of the 3rd day, before Arith came to my quarters for the long conversation, there was a smaller thing that happened that I keep returning to. I had gone to the station's common area, not the officer areas where I'd been housed, but the general transit common area, a large open space with seating and food dispensaries, and a view of the docking ring that I wanted to look at while I had the chance. It was mid-shift, and the area was occupied by the usual mix of transit passengers, Marathi traders, Keth civilians, a couple of compact survey staff I recognized from Zone 4 who waved at me with the particular wave of people who are glad to see a familiar face and too tired to do more about it. I was at a food dispensary getting a secondary cup of the coffee that apparently, per Arith's communication to the station catering staff, I was to be provided with on request, when a Keth child, young, the banding still forming, the secondary eyelids not yet fully developed, stopped next to me and looked up at me with an expression that I could read, despite the unfamiliar facial structure, as pure unself-conscious curiosity. The child said something in Keth. My caller rendered it as, "You are the human with the old document." Word apparently traveled on Keth border stations. "Yes," I said, "I am." The child said, "Draven says that your document means you are under the protection of the sovereignty." I assumed Draven was the young officer with the developing banding. "That's approximately correct," I said. The child looked at me for a long time. Then the child said in the careful, direct way that children ask questions that adults have learned not to ask, "Did you know, when you came here, did you know what the document was?" I looked at the child. I thought about how to answer this honestly. "No," I said, "I didn't know. I was just trying to get a transit visa." The child processed this. "But you had the document anyway," the child said. "I've had it for 15 years, I said. "I just never updated it." The child thought about this for a moment. Then the child said, "That seems right," which was possibly the most succinct summary of everything that had happened in the past 2 days that I was going to receive, and I appreciated it. A parent appeared and collected the child with the particular velocity of a parent who has spotted their child talking to a stranger and is unsure what has been said. I nodded at the parent. The parent, after a moment of assessment, pressed their palm flat against their chest, a gesture I didn't know, but which felt unmistakably like acknowledgement, and moved on. I stood there with my coffee. I thought, I want to remember this. Specifically this. Not the diplomatic discussions, not the formal language of covenant and seal and ward of. This. The child in the transit common area, asking the question directly, arriving at their own conclusion with the economy of a mind that hasn't yet learned to be indirect about things that seem obvious. That seems right. Yes, I thought so too. Later on the shuttle, I thought about what Arith had said in our long conversation on the 3rd day. Your people reach out with your whole weight behind it. You always have. And I thought about Dr. Nakamura, 31 hours without sleep, reaching into his jacket. And I thought about the child in the common area, but you had the document anyway. And I thought, yes, that's the whole thing right there. That's the thing the models couldn't account for. We carry the things that matter with us, not because we always know they matter, not because we have calculated the implications. Because we picked them up at 19 and they fit in our pocket and we never put them down. And one day we are standing in a queue on a border station, and we slide them under the glass and everything changes, and we are as surprised as anyone. We reach before we know what reaching means. We extend before we understand what extension commits us to. And then we find out later, in a room with chairs that fit our proportions and coffee that smells like home, that the reaching was the whole point. That what was being measured, across 600 years of failed projections and one very embarrassed academic division, was never whether we would survive. It was whether we would keep reaching. We would. We do. The lane ran on. The sun grew incrementally warmer through the forward port, the reliable mathematics of a closing distance. I had my documents in my pockets and my plate with the Keth sovereignty mark in my bag and the word in my head that wouldn't translate, and I thought about ground that was firm, and soil that breathed ghost light, and the ocean that was more of it than you understood until you stood on the edge of it. I was going home. The things that refuse to stop keep going. That's us. That has always been us. We were going home,